Hi, this is Ethan Bronner. I've been a journalist since I left Wesleyan pretty much, and I'm here talking with David Carlisle, who's done far more interesting things than that. And since I'm spent my life asking questions, I think I'll start it off with David. I've done a whole range of things, David. A lot of it was foreign, but I also was education editor and national education correspondent at the Times 20 years ago. And reading about Charles Drew, the university that you've been running for the last 11-ish years, it really has been very moving to me. It's a rare, interesting, essentially associated, you'll tell us more, I hope, a historically Black college university, but specifically focused on the medical profession, and also very interestingly established after the Watts riots in the mid-60s. So it doesn't have some historic segregationist past. It actually is in reaction to a lack of health care and also to general sense of inequality at the time in the place. And of course, we're in the middle of such a powerful national conversation about those very topics that I just wanted to ask you how you've been doing this thing, and suddenly you it feels like you're in the middle of the national spotlight, even though that's probably not the case. How does it feel on your end?
Well, it's these are exciting times at CDU for the reasons that you mentioned, Ethan, and we find ourselves kind of re-energized or the subject of renewed focus. Not that focus ever went away, but as you point out, we are a product of what we call the Watts Uprising of 1965. And we were created, Charles R. Drew University of Medicine and Science, basically in direct response to that out of the governor's McCone Commission at that time, Jerry Brown's father. Pat Brown, basically led to the creation of CDU. And so we call ourselves a community-founded university and have been involved in issues in South Los Angeles, South Central Los Angeles, the Watts Willowbrook area for 55 years. Fast forward to 2020 and 2021 with the COVID-19 pandemic. And we are as involved in the community as we've ever been. Leading a major COVID-19 testing program. We're now involved with other organizations in doing immunization, vaccination efforts, speaking about COVID-19. And then you add some of the social justice issues that arose in 2019, 2020. And we've been very engaged in that.
The COVID question makes me think. First of all, I now work for Bloomberg, and one of the things that's nice about working for Bloomberg is that all of the profit that's produced goes to his philanthropy. And this past year, Charles Drew University was one of the places that he gave a whole bunch of dough to. Am I right?
Yes, yeah. Correct.
So you can say thank you anytime to me. No, I'm kidding, but I mean, really,
thank you very much.
No, but it is very gratifying, and it's of course a little bit, when he does his sort of annual meeting with us, he says, your work produces mine, and that's lovely. So it makes you feel a little good about what you're doing. But one of the things that Mike said when he gave $100 million to 4 historically Black medical schools, including Charles Drew, is that there is a concern now that Blacks in America don't trust the medical system, and a much better way for them to be treated is through Black doctors and Black practiced medicine. And it strikes me as all the more relevant now what you guys are doing. I mean, you guys produce nurse practitioners, nurses, right, physician assistants, and doctors, right?
Yes, correct. And we've also expanded our undergraduate education programs to patch the leaks in the pipeline that occur before graduate school in these areas. And you and I, being at Wesleyan, certainly kind of saw how challenging it can be to be an undergraduate in a very high intensity educational space. But yeah.
So what does that mean? In what sense? I mean, what are you guys doing? Because one of the huge challenges, right, that I just actually recently returned my education days and wrote a piece for Bloomberg about the fact that in the late 90s, a lot of charter schools were doing everything they could to get minority first generation kids into college. And then when they did so, they discovered that many of them dropped out, and they needed to sort of shift and hold on to them in college in a particular way. Is that something that you guys have found, and what are you doing about it?
Well, this is something that we've taken on as a responsibility. Again, there are very few higher education institutions in our part of Los Angeles. That's a region comprised of over 1 million individuals. And so we represent a significant point of access to higher education for many young people from our community. In many ways, I was inspired by what you and I experienced at Wesleyan to want to bring this to CDU and basically say that CDU is going to become the nurturing, supporting, kind of East Coast style small private college environment for students that are aspiring to enter the health professions, and guide them through their undergraduate years successfully so that they can successfully apply to graduate schools in the health professions. And this is what Wesleyan offered me and provided me in a very affirmative way. I think of many of my classmates from the class of 1976. Many of us were first generation college students who then went on to become successful doctors, successful lawyers, and yes, successful journalists. And this is the kind of foundation that Wesleyan provides that is especially unique on the West Coast, because out here in California, we have large public universities. We don't have very many small, nurturing private universities.
But so is there anything you're doing in the community? I mean, once they get to you, I understand you're small, you're very community focused, and that helps. Do you reach out to the community to try to explain to people who live around that this is a place they might come to and be part of?
Yes, this is part of what it means to be community founded and community engaged. We have a pretty well-known program in higher education called the Saturday Science Academy. And this takes young students as young as age 4, pre-kindergarten, all the way through high school, and brings them onto our campus every Saturday for kind of higher education orientation and preparation. We also share our campus with the King Drew Magnet High School. And this is a science-focused high school in South Los Angeles. So yes, those are relationships that we have that we are cultivating going forward.
That's great, because that's another thing that in an attempt to help make sure not just the kids get to college, but through college, there has been a lot of that kind of thing going on, of colleges reaching into their communities. So that's interesting that you're doing that. And the other thing, of course, is the concern that non-whites are afraid of the vaccine because of the history of abuse. Are you finding that in your community? And if you are, is it easier to deal with because the professionals that they're looking to are themselves non-whites?
Well, Ethan, you bring up a very interesting point, and I've certainly encountered what I'd call vaccine hesitancy in the COVID-19 context. But what I see when I go out is that there is much more demand than supply for vaccination in under-resourced communities in Los Angeles. Pretty much everybody I know, now of course they're talking to me, I'm a doctor, but everybody I know can't wait to get vaccinated. Yes, there is what I would call, I think, slow vaccination hesitancy rather than outright vaccination resistance. More people that I know are kind of delaying or deferring vaccination in order to see how everybody else does once they get vaccinated. And many of those people, I'm sure, will convert into people who are receiving the vaccine at some point. Not encountering a lot of vaccination resistance, but it is there, to be sure. Certainly.
Well, but hesitancy, I mean, the sort of putting it off is kind of the most central aspect of hesitancy today, right? Because there's a sense that it was rushed out, and I don't want to be a guinea pig and all of that. So you're right that it's not quite the same as rejection, but it's still very problematic for us if we're trying to reach herd immunity, right?
And there is a foundation for this resistance. And we were still in college when the Tuskegee experiment was closed.
Of course.
Under the Nixon administration. So this is firsthand personal stuff for people like you and me. And it is invoked as well as other issues with the healthcare system, access to care issues, quality of care issues, having a provider in the neighborhood issues. These are still real-time issues in under-resourced communities. So in terms of resistance, yes, the Tuskegee experiment certainly has been a significant factor, but the issues in terms of trust with the healthcare system go beyond this, well beyond this. And this is why it's so important to make sure that we are diversifying the health professions, all professions, so that people from the communities that we want to serve, that we intend to serve, that we are serving, are coming into these professions and then turning around to go back and serve those communities when they become professionals.
That's, of course, that's 100% true, and it's true in my profession as well, of course, that there has been a kind of master narrative told by a particular kind of person who looks rather like me over these years. And to expand beyond that has been a big challenge and a very, very important aspect of what we do. But it's just so great that this is what you do. And also, when you took over at CDU, it was on the verge of bankruptcy. So you really had a task in front of you. And I take my hat off for the financial and fiscal health that you have brought to the place. It's really impressive. So, okay, so maybe we should talk a little bit about more personal things, David, since, here we are. We all put our pants on one leg at a time. And you spoke about first-generation families, but actually you're not. You came from a very distinguished parentage, right? I mean, your dad went to West Point, your mother was an architect.
Correct.
And that's just fantastically interesting. When your dad was at West Point, how many African Americans were there?
2.
Wow.
My father and his roommate, which didn't happen by accident. Ironically, however, they were both from California.
That is interesting. Is
California
there
even
an
then
explanation?
was cutting edge.
I see. That's very interesting. He grew up in California, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
born and raised.
Right. And the other thing that I read about you in preparation for talking to you is that he was a Christian Scientist.
Yes.
So that, of course, is, I wouldn't say anathema to medicine, but it isn't easily in keeping with medicine. So was that complicated for you and him when you decided to do this?
Well, no. I can't cite Christian Science scripture directly, but as I recall in my youth, one of the things that I do recall from the Christian Science Church was what I call a careful examination of facts and ideology and things. Which led me, I think, down the road to medical education and to medicine. I entered medical school with the blessing of my grandmother at the time. She was the Christian Scientist.
Really interesting.
My paternal grandmother, who raised my father to be a Christian Scientist, and there was no intrafamilial resistance to this.
But how do you explain why? So why does it surprise me? Do you think I'm misinformed about Christian Scientists?
Well, I think that's a good question.
One thinks that Christian Sciences is opposing a lot of medical treatment, blood transfusions, a lot of things that we think of as necessary. Right?
Yes, if you're not familiar with the religion, yes, that is entirely true. When somebody was ill, the term belief in a cold or belief in pneumonia was often used by church members. And the church was ideologically opposed, was my impression, to organized allopathic medical care. Yes.
So, okay, so explain to me why they were so accepting of it, because they were not very fervent members of the church?
Well, I would say my grandmother was a very fervent member. I remember going to the Mother Church in Boston
right.
When I was a very young kid.
Mm-hmm.
So I was certainly exposed to Christian Science. But I think in my mind, as it turned out, the emphasis really was on the word science. And as I got older, I got more and more involved in science. And I think my grandmother basically said, David, go off and do whatever makes you happy. That's the important thing. And my father said the same thing. And here I am now, I'm a physician.
Not what you normally expect a religious grandmother to say, but God bless her. I don't
Indeed,
know if you've been watching Shtisel on Netflix, but it's not how ultra Orthodox grandmothers would talk. I can tell you that.
indeed, yes, yes,
Okay, and you majored in chemistry, right? You studied with Max Tischler.
absolutely, yes.
Was he an important relationship for you?
Yes, he was. You know, I remember the first time that I met him, and he gave me a little tiny succulent cactus plant that remained with me through my entire time at Wesleyan and beyond. And you know, I would meet with Professor Tischler, I think at least on a biweekly basis, if
Wow.
not more frequently. We'd get together in his office about 7 o'clock in the morning, and he'd always ask me how I was doing academically. And being a chemistry major was difficult. All majors in college are difficult.
Yeah, no, but those hard science majors, they're killers. I mean, I didn't make it through organic chemistry. I mean, I made it through organic chemistry, but it was really unpleasant.
And it was great to have somebody like Max Tischler providing me with advice and mentoring and encouragement.
Yeah, but that's fantastic. So, and you, where did you live at what you were at Wesleyan?
I lived in the Foss Hill dormitories.
Mm-hmm.
And for those who are non-Wesleyan community members, you know, the Foss Hill's an Old English word, I guess, for cemetery. And of course, there was a cemetery right behind the dormitories, and there were some tombstones even up there, kind of around the dormitories.
Yeah.
And so I lived off campus in my last 2 years as a student as well. But that was a great experience being in the dorms at Wesleyan. I like to cite how the dorms are all connected by underground tunnels
Yeah.
to service, you know, provide access during the middle of the winter, and how we'd often get together like 1 and 2 o'clock in the morning for ping pong tournaments down there in the catacombs.
That's terrific. And then you went to medical school, and then you ended up back in LA, right?
Yes. Yes.
And you've been in a range of long time you spent in government as well, right? About a
Yes, I
dozen
served
years.
as 11 years as the director of the Office of Statewide Health Planning and Development in California government, appointed by Democrat Gray Davis, but served most of my time under Republican Arnold Schwarzenegger, and then a short amount of time under Pat Brown's son, Jerry Brown, as well.
That's interesting. I imagine that Schwarzenegger, although he's a Republican, is a very different Republican from the way the party has moved today, and that he was in some ways quite liberal on your issues, I would guess.
Yes, he was actually very, very well informed on issues. I mean, in addition to data and workforce policy, one thing that my office was very involved in was hospital seismic safety. We were basically
Mm.
department in charge of that. Obviously,
Mhm.
this is a big issue in California. In fact, you know, the ground was shaking here in California just a few minutes ago, a couple of hours ago.
That's right. I read that. Yes.
And we had
Yes.
a 4.0.
Hmm.
And Governor Schwarzenegger impressed me incredibly with his command of seismic safety facts, terminology, and policy. And that's just kind of the type of person he is. And
Was he a pleasure to work with?
he was quite a pleasure to work for, and he was kind of a policy geek, and I was impressed by that.
That's great. So, and you married a fellow doctor. Well, I mean, she was a medical student when you married her, right?
Yes, we were at Stanford together. Although when she got into Brown Medical School, I transferred from Stanford to Brown and graduated from the Brown program in medicine.
So you're ending up graduating from Brown instead of Stanford. That doesn't sound like a huge sacrifice, but probably in the world of medical school, Stanford was slightly fancier at the time. Brown was just starting out. But it reminds me of something else that I think I know about you, which is that you chose to go to Wesleyan over Princeton.
Yes, that is correct.
So what's wrong with you, man? No, I'm kidding. That's a brilliant move, and act. It was so. I'm actually sort of interested in that. If you can remember back, what led you to do that? Because it takes certain guts to choose a small liberal arts college over a fancy name like that.
Well, Wesleyan has a pretty fancy name too in my book.
I'm glad to hear that. We all agree.
I continue to send mostly aspiring pre-med students, but others as well, to Wesleyan, and or at least encourage them to take a look at Wesleyan. But there remains, and I wish I had my Wesleyan magazine with me. It's somewhere around here. I don't see it. But the cover of the current issue, I think, captures what Wesleyan is all about and has been all about. And it's not just this issue, but it's kind of every issue. And when I visited the Wesleyan campus, I was struck by the warmth of the visit. I was struck by the welcoming nature of the visit. I was struck by the support that was offered to me as a potential student at Wesleyan. So all those things kind of compelled a pretty easy decision on my part. And in retrospect, I can't say that it wasn't the correct decision.
No, I can't either. I think it was a brilliant move. I really didn't mean it as a critical, but you understand what I'm saying. Typically, I mean, and I'm sure we have the data at Wesleyan to look at the number of people who've been accepted at Harvard, Yale, and Princeton and chose Wesleyan is not non-existent, but it is in the other direction. But you began to talk about the cover of the most recent issue, but you didn't say what it was. And I think I know what you're talking about. So describe it for us, in case anybody out there doesn't remember.
Yes, you've got four individuals, and of various demographic groups, including I think the Wesleyan president was in the photograph, but what the photograph spoke to was diversity.
Exactly.
And diversity of interaction. So individuals from different generations, different ethnicities, different walks of life, all comprising the Wesleyan community. And the community was an integrated community in that people from disparate paths still get together. And if anything kind of captures my experience at Wesleyan, it was that. Although Ethan, we were just noting that you and I didn't know each other as undergraduates.
True, but 450 kids. You were busy with chemistry, and I was busy with literature. Mm-hmm. I'm sorry we didn't meet each other. You're a fabulous guy, but here we are. That's the beauty of it.
And back at you, yes. And but this was the cool thing about Wesleyan was that with a few exceptions, we knew most of the people in our class.
That's right.
And I look at the class of '76 updates that are published. Thank you very much. And I'm seeing names of people that I know that I remember from back then that I've not seen in ages, but I still remember them fondly. And Wesleyan is that kind of place. And it's so different from, the University of California. And I've been a UCLA faculty member for a number of years, still am. And so I can say that with some degree of authority. I mean, you're talking about a campus with 20 and 30,000 students. It's a very different environment. Yes, we get to the Final Four. Something that will elude Wesleyan for the time being, I'm sure. So you get that experience, but you don't get this this interpersonal environment where the chancellor, the president, people who are majoring in the College of Letters, people who are going to law school, going to business school, and these are lifelong relationships. That you don't get as a pre-med at a 40,000, 20,000 student campus.
100% true. Absolutely true. So tell us, you have two kids?
Yes, neither of whom followed my wife.
I was going to say, what the hell? You guys are failures as parents. What's going on here?
They chose a higher calling, I think they would both say, and they both entered law school. And they both started out as public defenders. My daughter is still a public defender. She works for the Bronx Defenders right there in New York City, with I'm sure any number of alumni of Wesleyan.
I know the Bronx Defenders well. That's where she works. That's fantastic.
Yes. And our son started out as a public defender for Alameda County, City of Oakland, and recently transitioned to the Department of Public Health for the state of California.
Well, now he's combining a little family background. So yes. He does legal stuff for the Department of Health. That's what he's going to do. Yes,
Department of Public Health, and no surprise, they're legal pursuits that occur within government, and he has a courtroom background, and it comes in handy.
It is really funny though that both of your kids, the children of two doctors, both became lawyers. I mean, it's an interesting act of rebellion, David.
Well, I think it's one of those genetic things that may skip a generation. We'll see. We'll see.
We'll see.
Well, Ethan, it's serendipitous that we're getting together today because, again, I don't recall us ever getting together when we were at Wesleyan. But as I said before, I've actually encountered your name and in bylines from the New York Times, and you know, I'm not a foreign policy geek kind of person. But I do read enough that I've seen your name. So tell me more about what you've been up to since 1976.
So I pretty quickly I did COL, and I was very interested in French at that time, and then I became interested in Spanish, moved to South America, and then I slowly understood that what I'd like to do is journalism. I went to Columbia Journalism School in the late 70s. And then my first job was at the Miami Herald. And then I moved to Reuters in London, and then to Madrid, to Brussels, then to Jerusalem for Reuters, where I met my wife, not my current wife, my only wife. And then we moved back, and I worked for the Boston Globe for a dozen years, but 6 of them back in the Middle East, based in Israel. And then I joined the Times in the late 90s, where I stayed for 17 years. And I did mostly foreign stuff, but for a couple of years I was on the editorial page, and I was the deputy foreign editor, and I was the deputy national editor. And I also wrote about, as I mentioned earlier, education and legal affairs. One of the nice things about journalism. And then 6 years ago, I got an offer I couldn't refuse from Bloomberg, and have been actually very, very happy at Bloomberg doing international politics stuff. More Latin America than the Middle East because of the way the place is structured. But I've been overseeing a lot of COVID coverage in places that are just devastated by it, as you know, in Brazil and Peru. Yes. Really terrible stories, and in Mexico. So yes. I've been really enjoying is the wrong word, but feeling very fulfilled by the work. So that's what I've been mostly doing. As I said, I did what I started to say a minute ago before I talked about Bloomberg, is that one of the things that's nice about journalism is it allows you to be an amateur at a whole bunch of things, right? And in fact, it's one of the few places where not being a deep expert is kind of needed, if not prized, because if you know too much about something, you start to take things for granted. You start to speak to a certain class of people rather than to a larger class of people. And, one of the things that I loved about being a foreign correspondent, and I was abroad for many years, so I always felt more alive when I was a stranger somewhere. Mm-hmm. So when I talk to young people about going into journalism, I sort of try to probe about what is it that's going to work for them. It's not the only way, because you also have passionate investigative reporters who want to go get the bad guys and don't necessarily want to step back, that kind of thing. You need a whole bunch of different kinds of people. And I've done both editing and reporting. I've been on both sides of that divide, which I often think of as similar to the divide between drivers and pedestrians, which is that each group is convinced the other is a bunch of assholes. So, it works out very well when you've been on both sides. So that's what I've basically been doing, and very happily so. As I said, I married an Israeli woman. She's of Yemeni origin, by the way. And yes, her mother is still illiterate to this day, and Nomi has a PhD from Columbia. So, it's the kind of, some of the kind of generational gap that you are familiar with at CDU, first generation and so on. And we have 2 sons. One was in tech. He went to Wesleyan, actually, class of 10. And is now, yes, thank you. And is now in the art world. He's an art dealer. He works for a small gallery in Chelsea. And our younger son is about to start becoming a social worker at a social work school. So, right? We all have our journeys filled with challenges and difficulties, and you've met yours so brilliantly. So, David, I take my hat off to you again. It's been...
I take my hat off to you, Ethan. One of the components of the journey, of course, has been not infrequent interaction with the press, and I I just want to, commend you on your work, which has been fantastic. But also just journalism in general, because it is that access to information that I think is one of the things that is an important definition of what it means to be the United States, and defines our culture and our character. And without it, we just wouldn't be the country that we are today. And I think it's been challenged recently, unfortunately. And it just underscores how important the press and the media are in the United States. And yes, I am a subscriber to the New York Times, and as I said, a devotee of Bloomberg as well.
That's great. That's kind of you, David. And I broadly, completely agree with you about the importance of honest, decent information in context. It's really central, absolutely, to a democracy, and it has been deeply challenged, as we all know. And our classmate Alan Miller had created a thing for news literacy, so it's in the family here too. Wonderful to talk to you. Look forward to seeing you virtually in this reunion in May, and somewhere on the trail. I hope I'll come see you, if you don't mind, at CDU next time in LA.
Looking forward to it. You're always welcome, Ethan, and if not at CDU, maybe at Wesleyan sometime soon.